Always a pleasure to be at the Economic Times Global Summit. And this summit is really being held at a time in India for more than one reason. The economic issues have temporarily taken a backseat. But I'm quite sure that India has gradually been moving in a direction where politics is increasingly being influenced by the economic issues. I just wanted to share a few broad experiences of what I've seen, particularly in the last 5 years, the kind of change taking place and the kind of direction it indicates for India to move in the future. I think India has a good reason to be more than satisfied. But India has still a better reason to still be impatient. We've achieved a lot. We are, for the first time across the 5 years, amongst the large economies, the fastest growing. We have moved up the ladder as far as ease of doing business is concerned. The economy is gradually formalizing more and more. Almost in a period of 5 years, our taxation collections will be close to almost doubling. Our assessee bases are increasing. The size of India's middle class is growing exponentially. And that's one factor which is not going to only influence domestic demand, but also global demand. That's also going to dictate a lot of global investment. And there is a particular direction that India has taken. When I said India has a lot more reason to be impatient about, with this growing middle class, with a lot of aspirational people wanting to join that middle class, that's all contributing to the impatience. And that is what compels policymakers to move in a particular direction. I don't think India is the place where we can judge India by what's happened in the last 3-4 months or what's going to happen in the next 3-4 months, because announcements made by several people during this period appear to be policy aberrations. But once the heat and dust of politics settle down and elections go into the background, I think one of the great lessons we've learnt is that India was waiting to become a more honest society. Governments had discretions, politicians and civil servants had unlimited power. There were no guidelines. The only remedy was some kind of review, either administrative or audit or judicial. From a taxation point of view, we were non-compliant. We always complained that a very large part of our economy was the parallel economy. And I think the last 5 years significantly become a turning point where the so-called violators or offenders or deviators have realized that it's no longer safe to be on that course. Systems are becoming more transparent, government discretions are getting eliminated. And it's possible in India, as a developing society which had reconciled to that kind of culture, it's possible to run India and govern India in a more transparent and honest manner. reforms are not as simple across the last 2.5, 3 decades that we saw. But there is a lot of public pressure on policymakers and at times even the opponents to agree to a certain category of reforms. I remember where session after session the constitutional amendment on GST used to be adjourned. There was huge public opinion pressure, media pressure, trade and industry pressure, and therefore at times for positioning purposes many had to fall in line. Their subsequent utterances clearly indicated their inner desire, but the vote in Parliament was to the contrary. When bank NPAs climaxed and reached a disproportionate level, and you had to find extraordinary solutions for that kind of a problem, an unprecedented problem we were facing, because the credit cycle itself had broken down. People were not paying banks, so banks were not in a position to lend again. In a period of almost 4.5 months, from the introduction of the IBC to the parliamentary committee to the passage by both houses of parliament and its implementation. Now it's unthinkable that a major earth-shaking reform of this kind could pass through every stage of the legislative process, including the committees, and all this be done in a timeline of 4.5 months. And I think, therefore, the impatience of India is going to compel India to be on a particular course. And the third very important observation I made was that one big hurdle ever since 1991 in the reform process which used to take place was that are these changes only meant for a particular section of society, and therefore the underprivileged get completely left out of it. And that's why reforming was never considered to be good politics, even though it was good economics. And I think in finding out a mix between a market economy with a social conscience, within the limitation of Indian resources, India started moving closer in that direction. The greater formalization of the economy, the expansion of tax revenues. Who did it benefit? Of course, it benefited expenditure on infrastructure and so on. It benefited the states because their shares also increased. It also benefited in a large number those who were conventionally considered completely out of it. So 40 years of OROP, no wait for 2 years and 3 years for the 7th Pay Commission to be implemented. Almost every section of the working class, the farmers, the informal sector employees. And instead of the Garibi Hatao kind of slogans, which over the last 4 or 5 decades had only transmitted slogans to the poor, because of this greater expansion and a better growth rate, India was able to deliver resources instead of slogans as far as the poor were concerned.
So thank you, Mr. Jaitley, for that very comprehensive address. I think you touched upon a whole variety of issues, both on economics and also politics. So I'll ask you a political question, since this is a political season. You also talked about the fact that economic reforms, widely defined, the steps on health insurance, the steps on reaching out to the unorganized section of the workforce, has put in place a basic welfare network in place. And the economic achievements of the government is a major plank for winning the election. But do you think in India, there is always this debate, can elections be won on economic factors alone, or as we say in Hindi, bhavna, the feelings also come into play? I mean, is this enough to win an election?
Well, I think you have to blend good governance with clever politics. Where you are able to reach the right blend of that. Otherwise, a sound bureaucrat would be a Prime Minister of India. And that's not likely to happen.
Someone can say that happened for about 10 years.
Well, let that be your judgment.
So let me ask you another question. You also talked about the increased compliance in, basically a crackdown on tax evasion, and those numbers do bear out the fact that the quantum of tax evasion is coming down. There's also no question that societies which are more tax compliant are richer societies and more well-off societies than societies that aren't. There's no debate about it. But in terms of one aspect of the NBFC crisis and the liquidity crisis, and you may like to, is the fact that it's become obvious that for many Indian companies, their balance sheets don't reflect the truth, right? Balance sheets are manipulated. Is that something which you...
Well, that is exactly what we want to make history. Now let's come to this. How did this crisis of balance sheet really emerge? Post 2008, the Lehman crisis, where it was quite obvious, and nobody would have expected the same level of growth that you had in the world or in any country during the boom period, that post-Lehman that could not have continued. And therefore, to artificially go after a figure, you tell the banking system, open your door, open your safes, and whoever comes, lend whatever you can. No securities, no evaluation of projects. Now, obviously, if you lend disproportionately, for some time, you'll create a capacity, you'll have some optical deception, oh, there is growth, but ultimately it won't be a sustainable growth. It'll be completely debt-led, and the debt is not likely to come back. And that's what happened. Now, along with that, in many cases, there was also evidence of malpractices. Money is being siphoned out. The kind of SFIO inquiries that we are going through almost established that. And therefore, a discipline had to be imposed. And I've been very clear that it was not merely the government, not merely the banks, even the regulator had a lot to do during that period, but all of them just wanted this artificial growth, which was debt-led, to continue. Now, post-2015, when you suddenly realized after the asset quality review that the country was being taken for a ride, the NPAs were hidden below the carpet. They were not 2.5 lakhs, they were 8.5 lakh crores. And that's when you started acting. And I think it was a painful 2-3 year process, but fortunately, in the last 6-8 months, we've seen the curve turning. And I'm sure in the next 1 year, it'll turn a lot more for the better. Coupled with this factor, plus the factor I mentioned, that a chilling message has gone loud and clear, that you're going to be better off if you are honest. Because otherwise you are going to be found out, if not today, tomorrow. I think the second factor that impacted the NBFCs, particularly, that NBFC had a very important role to play. Post-demonetization, where all the cash which was anonymously circulating in the system, when it went into the banks, what would the banks do with it? A lot of it came to the mutual funds. From the mutual funds, it went into the NBFCs. And the banks were in no position to give out large amounts as loan, particularly to certain sectors, or real estate, SMEs, a lot of other sectors were being funded by these NBFCs. And therefore, you can't have a situation on one hand, we continue with the strict norms on credit and allow the liquidity to be squeezed out. No amount of autonomy that the central bank can enjoy can permit it to deviate from its essential function, that is to ensure that there is credit and there is liquidity. Autonomy is to be used to further these two, not to curtail these two, because it has to be exercised. It's a very good idea, but it has to be to pursue this. And I think finally, everybody seems to have realized that you need funding sources to come from both the formal banking sector as also from these sectors like the NBFCs, which were playing a very important role.
So I take up to you talked about a chilling message being sent out to wrongdoers. In some cases, but however, in some cases the message may have got too chilling. The famous the FIR against Chanda Kochar, which you wrote about, could be one example of that.
You see, I'll tell you, when you are trying to reform a system and bring it in line so that people act as per the best business practices, I think it is also important that whether it's the states or the center, investigating agencies also have to go by some very high standards. And the high standards have to be, first it has to be integrity, second has to be compliance of law, third has to be fairness. So nobody who's guilty gets away and nobody who's innocent is unnecessarily harassed. And therefore, people noticed it this time, but if you recollect, sometimes last year, when the chairperson or chairman of the Bank of Maharashtra was arrested, I strongly protested. Because when I looked at the facts, I found no case. And after keeping him for 2 or 3 weeks in prison, he got bail. And after 4 months, you file an application in court, we are very sorry, we don't have a case against him. You shattered the man's career, his reputation. Fortunately, we were able to reinstate him back. And therefore, it's not only in this case, but all across. Just because I am in government, I must blindly accept everything that the investigative agencies do. I don't follow that principle. And therefore, I have been quite liberal in my comments about them also.
So, one accused, I mean, if you can, you talked about various, what you described as various fake issues. One issue where this government has faced charges is the so-called attack on institutions. I mean, the RBI, you of course referred to it briefly. Would you like to comment on that? I mean,
you see, I think it's a completely fake issue. Let's be clear. Let's start from each institution. First, the judiciary. The only issue we had with the judiciary was within the constitutional framework. They recommend several names for appointment. Under the constitutional law as interpreted by the Supreme Court, government can give its opinion, appoint some people and send 1 or 2 cases back with some information. We exercise that right. Oh, it's an attack on an institution. And who attacked us? Those who were intimidating the court. Those who were filing fake impeachments against the Chief Justice in order to send a message to every judge that should you not agree with us. Have you seen the manner in which judges have been cowed down at times in court by the kind of noise which a section of disruptionists have been making there? Have you seen after judgments come the kind of social media attacks which have been made on some of them? And I'm glad I saw a statement by the Chief Justice a few days ago. In fact, there's a realization also in that. So the institutional wreckers will do something every day to accuse a judge. And then you say, well, why did you refer one case back? Well, that's within the framework of the Constitution. Now, RBI. Pandit Nehru in 1955 got B. Rama Rao to resign as the RBI governor. Mrs. Gandhi got Jagannathan to resign because he refused to sanction a loan for Maruti and brought in that former LIC chairman, Puri,
yep.
K.R. Puri. Then Puri was asked to resign and Dr. I.G. Patel came in. Then Mr. Yashwant Sinha asked Malhotra to resign, R.N. Malhotra. My predecessor was not on speaking terms with two governors. Their memoirs can be read. And what is the attack? That the government, which is the largest stakeholder in the economy, is using every method at its disposal, statutory and non-statutory, to stay. We can't starve the market. We can't squeeze credit, we can't squeeze liquidity. That will hurt the growth, that will hurt the economy. And the proof of the pudding is several column writers, including those who were not on speaking terms with the governors and those who had dismissed governors in the past, spoke out. But not one voice from the real stakeholders, the people who do business in the market, came out and said we disagree with the government, because they knew where the shoe is pinching. Your real estate sector came to a standstill. That will have a spiral effect on cement, steel, labor, employment. And the data was showing that. During the peak of the period, the auto sales started following, because loans were not coming for that from the NBFCs. And therefore, raising an issue of interest to the economy, which everybody concedes is in the larger interest, or is tinkering with an institution. Well, I've said this earlier and I repeat, the country is more important than any institution, be it the government, but be it any other institution.
I'll ask, I can't help asking you a couple of geopolitical related questions, given what's the Pulwama incident and its aftermath. Are there, I'm not asking you to obviously disclose any secrets, but are there a range of, it seems to be a range of non-military measures, given that India can also contemplate against Pakistan?
Well, I think India today is extremely angry. And I can tell you, in my lifetime, we've seen wars, we've seen human tragedies, we've seen our prime ministers being assassinated by terrorists. But the kind of anger which has been there, even on previous occasions, the one this time is unprecedented. There's a huge gap between the strength of the two countries. And Pakistan doesn't learn. And therefore, without getting into the details, I think, as the Prime Minister has said, India will exercise all instruments at its command, whether it is diplomatic or otherwise. And therefore, we have to act in a manner that this battle has to be decisively won by us. Because Pakistan is not willing to give up its traditional role in our neighborhood as a rogue state. You see, the head of the government says, give me actionable intelligence. Well, you need actionable intelligence if it's a blind offense. And you can only give some clues. But here's a man sitting in your own country who's owned up to the offense. So when there is a confession, there is not even an evidence in any court in the world. So you have people sitting in your own country admitting to the offense that, yeah, we've done it, giving credit for it. Amongst the people who were killed 2 days thereafter, 2 of them turned out to be Pakistani citizens who were associated by the JEM. And therefore you still want evidence, and you can simply come out with blatant denials. I think Pakistan is riding a tiger on this issue. And the tiger never spares its own rider. So sooner or later you are going to reach a situation of this kind. But speaking for India, as the Prime Minister has already clarified, I think India has all options. You need not exhaust all options on day one. This is not a one-week battle. It should be undertaken in various forms.
You can say that India has much more to lose than Pakistan. Pakistan also has large elements of irrational behavior. It's a nuclear-armed state. So, in a sense, our economy is much larger. We've made a lot of progress.
You see, India has a huge amount of resilience. And the resilience and the size of the economy, our capacity is far more, our fundamentals are far more sound. And I'm afraid I can't say that about their economy. They must seriously introspect. Remember, in the 70s, When Bangladesh got created as a nation, where was Bangladesh as an economy? Today, in every economic parameter, it is way ahead of them. They've gone to the IMF for the 13th time in a row.
Which we used to go once upon a time.
No, we went once, but that was history.
That was 22, yeah.
That was 27 years ago.
Right. So we talked of bhavna in the context of elections. Do you think there has been an excess of bhavna when it comes to cricket matches at international tournaments between India and Pakistan?
You see, there is, as I said, India is very angry, and therefore this is a reaction. And the reaction is that you can't be seen playing friendly, even competitive matches with them at a time where there is such a hostile environment in the country. So the feeling of the people is understandable on this. But I feel that, and this kind of a sentiment is more natural in India. And the alternative narrative, which finds greater space in the media than probably on the ground, that any kind of subversion, extremist element, separatist element, subversive elements of various ideologies, those people find greater reflection in the media, but on the ground, they don't even win a municipal poll. And therefore, I think this reflection of concern for the country, and this cuts across caste, it cuts across religion, it's almost uniform. It cuts across states.